The Confrontation. In the quiet heart of Mississippi, where the sun hung low over golden fields, lived an elderly black farmer named Mr. Johnson. His skin was weathered, telling tales of hard work and long days under the sun. He had been working this land for over 50 years, planting seeds and harvesting crops with care. It was not just his livelihood, it was his legacy. On a warm afternoon, as Mr. Johnson tended to his crops, the calm of the day was shattered by the sound of engines. A police car rolled up the dirt road, stirring up dust behind it. Mr. Johnson straightened up and squinted against the sun, watching as two officers stepped out. Their faces were stern, and their posture suggested they were looking for trouble. "Hey, old man," one of the officers shouted, walking toward him. His tone was loud and mocking. "What are you doing here? You don't belong on this land." Mr. Johnson felt a surge of anger. He had owned this land for decades. It was his home, his pride. "This is my land," he replied calmly, planting his hands on his hips. "I have every right to be here." The second officer stepped forward, sneering. "We're just checking to see if you're causing any trouble. People like you shouldn't be out here alone." His words dripped with contempt, making Mr. Johnson's blood boil. "People like me," Mr. Johnson echoed, his voice steady. "What do you mean by that? I'm just a farmer, like everyone else." The first officer laughed, a cruel sound that filled the air. "Oh, come on. You know what we mean. You should be thankful we're even talking to you. You ought to be grateful we're not dragging you off to jail." Mr. Johnson stood tall, feeling the weight of generations behind him. "You don't scare me. I've faced worse than you in my life. You think I'm afraid because of the color of my skin." For a moment, the officers seemed taken aback. They weren't used to being challenged. The first officer stepped closer, invading Mr. Johnson's personal space. "You're just an old man on a farm. Don't get too bold. We could make things very difficult for you." In that moment, Mr. Johnson thought of his son. He was a lawyer now, respected in the community. He had worked hard to break down the walls of hate and prejudice. Mr. Johnson took a deep breath, knowing he had to stand firm. "You don't know who my son is, do you? You don't know what he has done for this community." The officers exchanged glances, confusion washing over their faces. "What do you mean?" the second officer asked, his tone suddenly wary. Mr. Johnson's heart raced as he prepared to tell them. "My son is a lawyer. He fights against injustice and stands up for people like me. You think you can come here and bully me? You have no idea who you are dealing with." The first officer frowned, trying to regain his authority. "That doesn't matter. You're still just an old farmer. We can make your life difficult if we want to." But Mr. Johnson was unyielding. "You can try, but you won't succeed. I've seen too much in my life to be afraid of a couple of racist cops." The air crackled with tension. Mr. Johnson felt a surge of pride for standing his ground. The officers, however, seemed to shift nervously. They weren't used to facing resistance, especially from someone they considered just an old man. Before the officers could respond, Mr. Johnson pulled out his phone and pressed record. "I want evidence of this harassment," he declared. "You think you can come here and intimidate me without consequences? I won't let you." The officers' expressions changed from aggression to unease. They knew the power of a recorded conversation. "You shouldn't be doing that," the second officer warned, his bravado fading. "This is a warning." Mr. Johnson felt a rush of determination. A warning? For what? "Standing up for myself." He glanced around, noticing neighbors peering from their homes, watching the scene unfold. "This is my land, and I will not be bullied. You will leave, and you will leave me in peace." As he spoke, the first officer seemed to lose his grip on the situation. "Fine," he huffed, but his tone was less confident now. "We'll be watching you, old man. Don't think this is over." Mr. Johnson didn't flinch. "You can watch all you want. Just remember, I'm not the one who should be afraid." With that, the officers climbed back into their car, the tension still thick in the air. As they drove away, Mr. Johnson felt a mix of relief and pride. He had stood up for himself, but he knew this wouldn't be the end. He couldn't shake the feeling that they would return, and next time, they might not be so easily deterred. As the dust settled behind the police car, Mr. Johnson returned to his crops, his heart still racing. He thought about his son and how he would react to this confrontation. He hoped that one day, things would change for the better. But for now, he had made a stand, and that was enough. In the distance, the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the fields. Mr. Johnson took a deep breath, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. He was a farmer, a father, and a man who would never back down the son's reputation. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Mr. Johnson stood in his fields, still feeling the adrenaline from the confrontation with the officers. The peaceful sounds of crickets chirping and the rustle of leaves surrounded him, yet his mind was racing. He couldn't shake the unease that came with knowing the cops might return. Mr. Johnson finished his work for the day, the weight of the world resting on his shoulders. He walked back to his small farmhouse, his heart heavy, but his spirit unbroken. Inside, he found his wife, Mrs. Johnson, cooking dinner. She looked up and smiled, but concern filled her eyes. "Did the police bother you again?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. Mr. Johnson sighed, sitting down at the kitchen table. "They came by today. They thought they could intimidate me because of the color of my skin, but I stood my ground." Mrs. Johnson placed a pot of beans on the table and sat across from him. "I'm proud of you, but you know this isn't over. They might come back." "I know," he replied, looking down at the table. "But I mentioned our son. I told them he's a lawyer, someone who fights against injustice. Maybe that will make them think twice." The thought of their son, Michael, filled Mr. Johnson with both pride and hope. Michael had always been passionate about fairness and equality. After graduating from law school, he had returned to their small town to help the community. He worked tirelessly, often taking on cases pro bono, especially for those who couldn't afford legal help. "Michael is making a difference," Mrs. Johnson said, breaking the silence. "He's well respected in town. I just hope the police remember who they're dealing with." As they ate, Mr. Johnson shared stories about Michael's recent victories in court. Last week, he helped a family who lost their home to a discriminatory landlord. He fought hard, and the judge ruled in their favor. The community is starting to see that change is possible. Mrs. Johnson smiled, her eyes shining with pride. "He is our legacy. He's doing what we always dreamed of, standing up for what's right." Later that evening, as the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Mr. Johnson picked up his phone. He hesitated for a moment, then dialed Michael's number. After a few rings, his son answered. "Hey, Dad, how's everything going?" Michael's cheerful voice brought a smile to Mr. Johnson's face. "Things are all right, but we had a little trouble with the police today," Mr. Johnson said, his voice steady despite the weight of his words. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "What happened?" Mr. Johnson recounted the encounter, detailing how the officers had tried to intimidate him. As he spoke, he could hear Michael's breathing grow more serious. "Dad, I'm so sorry you had to go through that. You shouldn't have to face that kind of disrespect. I'll come by tomorrow to talk to you," Michael replied, his tone firm. Mr. Johnson felt a wave of relief. "I appreciate it, son, but I don't want you to put yourself in danger because of this. You have a lot of important work to do." Michael paused. "This is important work, Dad. You are important. Standing up to those bullies isn't just about you. It's about everyone who's faced this kind of treatment. They need to know they can't just walk over people like us." Mr. Johnson smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest. "You're right. I just want you to be safe. I'll be careful, I promise. But I'm coming. We'll figure this out together," Michael assured him. After hanging up, Mr. Johnson felt a mix of hope and anxiety. He knew that with Michael's help, they could stand against the injustice they faced. But deep down, he also worried about the risks involved. He didn't want his son to be caught in the crossfire of hatred. The next morning, Mr. Johnson woke up early, the sun just starting to rise. He walked outside, breathing in the cool morning air, feeling the dew on the grass beneath his feet. He knew he had to keep his spirits high, not just for himself, but for the community he loved. As he tended to his crops, he thought about all the people in town who relied on him. He was not just a farmer. He was a symbol of resilience and strength for many. They would look to him for guidance, especially during times of trouble. Later that day, Michael arrived, looking confident and determined. He greeted Mr. Johnson with a warm hug, the kind that made the world feel a little lighter. "Let's talk about what happened," he said, his voice steady. They sat on the porch, and Mr. Johnson recounted everything in detail. Michael listened intently, his brow furrowing at the mention of the officer's behavior. "This is unacceptable," he said. "We need to document everything and make sure the community knows what happened. They can't hide behind their badges anymore." Mr. Johnson nodded, feeling empowered. "I agree. It's time to stand together and show them that we won't be silenced." As they talked, Mr. Johnson could see the fire in his son's eyes. Michael was ready to fight, not just for his father, but for everyone who had ever faced discrimination. The two of them, side by side, felt like a team ready to take on the world. In that moment, Mr. Johnson realized that their family bond was more than just love. It was a shared mission to bring about change. With his son by his side, he felt stronger than ever. They were ready to face whatever came next, united against the darkness of hate and prejudice, rallying the community. The next morning, a thick fog rolled over the fields as Mr. Johnson and Michael sat together on the porch, discussing their plan. The air was cool, and the world was still waking up. Mr. Johnson could feel a sense of urgency building inside him. They couldn't let the police's intimidation go unchecked. "Dad, we need to rally the community," Michael said, leaning forward with determination. "If we come together, we can show the police that we won't tolerate this kind of treatment." Mr. Johnson nodded, feeling a spark of hope. "You're right. We need to let people know what happened. We can't stay silent." Michael pulled out his phone and began typing a message. "I'll send out a call for a meeting tonight at the community center. Everyone needs to hear what the police did." As Michael crafted the message, Mr. Johnson thought about the people in their community. They had faced their share of struggles, and many had been silenced for too long. But together, they could find their voice. When Michael finished, he hit send and looked at his father. "We'll need to prepare for questions. People will want to know what they can do to help." Later that afternoon, Mr. Johnson and Michael made their way to the community center. The sun shone brightly, illuminating the dusty roads they traveled. With each step, Mr. Johnson felt a growing sense of responsibility. This was not just about him. It was about everyone who had ever felt the sting of discrimination. As they arrived, they saw a small crowd already gathered outside the center. Neighbors exchanged worried glances, their faces reflecting a mix of concern and determination. Mr. Johnson felt a swell of pride. These were his people, standing together in solidarity. Inside the community center, they set up chairs in a circle, creating a safe space for everyone to share their thoughts. As the crowd filled the room, whispers filled the air, the tension palpable. When everyone was seated, Michael stood up. "Thank you all for coming," he said, his voice strong but calm. "We're here today because we need to talk about what happened to my father." The room fell silent, all eyes on Michael. "Yesterday, 2 police officers came to our farm and tried to intimidate my dad. They used their badge to bully him, simply because of his skin color. This is not just an isolated incident. It's a pattern we've seen too many times." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Mr. Johnson felt a rush of gratitude for his son's bravery. Michael continued, "We need to take a stand. We cannot let this kind of behavior go unchallenged. We have to show the police that we're united and that we will not tolerate discrimination. A woman in the back raised her hand. But what can we do? We're just ordinary people. Michael smiled encouragingly. We're not just ordinary people, we're a community. Together, we can organize a peaceful protest. We can march to the police station and demand accountability. The crowd buzzed with excitement and nervous energy. Mr. Johnson could see faces lighting up with determination. I know many of you have faced similar issues, he added. But if we come together, we can amplify our voices. An older man spoke up, his voice shaky but resolute. I've lived here my whole life, and I've seen things I wish I hadn't. If we stand together, maybe we can change things for the next generation. The room erupted in applause, and Mr. Johnson's heart swelled. This was the moment they had been waiting for, a chance to fight back and reclaim their dignity. We need to spread the word, Michael said, rallying the crowd. Let's tell our friends and family. We'll meet again tomorrow to plan the details of the protest. Let's make our voices heard. As the meeting came to a close, people began to chat excitedly, exchanging phone numbers and ideas. Mr. Johnson felt the energy in the room, a sense of purpose binding them together. They were no longer just individuals facing challenges. They were a united force ready to confront injustice. After the meeting, Mr. Johnson and Michael stepped outside, the sun setting behind them, casting long shadows across the parking lot. I can't believe how many people showed up, Mr. Johnson said, a smile breaking across his face. This is what we needed. Michael nodded, his eyes shining with enthusiasm. We're just getting started, Dad. We can make a real difference. As they walked home, Mr. Johnson felt a renewed sense of hope. The world around them was changing, and they were part of that change. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but with his son by his side and a community ready to stand together, he felt unstoppable. That night, as Mr. Johnson lay in bed, he thought about the generations that had come before him. He thought about the struggles they had faced and the sacrifices they had made. He realized that this fight was about more than just him or even Michael. It was about honoring their legacy and ensuring a better future for those who came after them. In the quiet of the night, Mr. Johnson drifted off to sleep with a sense of purpose. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but he was ready to face them head-on. The fight for justice had just begun, and he was determined to see it through. The march for justice. The sun rose brightly the next morning, illuminating the small town with golden rays. Mr. Johnson woke up with a sense of purpose. Today was the day they would march, and he could feel the energy buzzing in the air. He quickly got dressed, his heart pounding with excitement and nerves. After breakfast, Michael joined his father outside. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, his voice steady, but filled with anticipation. "I am," Mr. Johnson replied, taking a deep breath. "We've talked about it for so long, and now it's finally happening." As they made their way to the community center, they saw neighbors and friends gathering, holding homemade signs with messages of hope and solidarity. No justice, no peace. Read one sign, while another proclaimed, "Together we stand." Mr. Johnson felt a swell of pride as he took in the sight of his community coming together for a common cause. When they reached the center, the atmosphere was electric. People of all ages had gathered, ready to stand up against injustice. Michael stood on a chair to address the crowd. "Thank you all for coming. Today, we're going to show the police that we won't be silenced. We're here to demand respect and equality." The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices echoing through the community center. Mr. Johnson looked around, feeling a mix of emotions. This was not just a march, it was a statement, a declaration that they would no longer tolerate discrimination. After a brief moment of preparation, the group began to assemble outside. With signs held high and hearts full of determination, they started their march down the main street of town. The rhythmic sound of their footsteps echoed against the pavement, creating a sense of unity that surged through the crowd. As they walked, They chanted slogans that resonated in their hearts. What do we want? Justice. When do we want it? Now. Each chant seemed to give them more strength, fueling their resolve. Mr. Johnson felt the weight of his ancestors' struggles lift, replaced by a sense of pride and determination. As they approached the police station, the atmosphere shifted. Mr. Johnson could see officers standing outside, watching them with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. He felt a knot of anxiety in his stomach, but reminded himself that they were there to stand up for what was right. Michael raised his voice, urging the crowd to hold their ground. We're here to demand justice. We want accountability for those who misuse their power. We are not afraid. The crowd roared in response, and Mr. Johnson felt a surge of courage. This was their moment to shine, to make their voices heard. They reached the steps of the police station, and Michael stepped forward, addressing the officers. We're here to tell you that we deserve respect and fairness. No one should have to fear the people who are supposed to protect them, he said, his voice strong and unwavering. A few officers shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. Mr. Johnson noticed one officer step forward, a woman with a determined look on her face. She cleared her throat and spoke. We hear you, and we want to understand your concerns. We're here to listen. The crowd murmured, surprised but cautiously optimistic. Michael took a step closer. This isn't just about listening. It's about taking action. We want real changes in how you treat our community. The officer nodded, her expression softening. We understand that trust has been broken, and we want to rebuild that trust. But we need your help to do it. Mr. Johnson felt a wave of hope wash over him. Maybe, just maybe, this could lead to real change. The crowd listened intently, eager for a path forward. As they discussed their concerns, more community members began to share their experiences, speaking of times when they had been treated unfairly. Mr. Johnson's heart ached as he listened to their stories, each one a reminder of the deep-rooted issues that needed to be addressed. After hours of dialogue, the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the scene. Michael turned to the crowd. We've made our voices heard today, and we have opened a line of communication. But this is just the beginning. We need to keep pushing for change. Mr. Johnson nodded in agreement, feeling empowered. The march had united them in ways he had never imagined. They were no longer just individuals facing their struggles. They were a community standing strong together. As they began to disperse, Mr. Johnson noticed the officer who had spoken earlier approaching him. Sir, she said, her tone respectful, I appreciate your bravery today. I want to assure you that we are committed to making things better in this town. Mr. Johnson felt a mix of surprise and gratitude. Thank you. We just want to be treated fairly, like everyone else. I understand, she replied. It won't happen overnight, but I promise we will work on this. Your voices matter, and we're listening. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Mr. Johnson and Michael walked home together, feeling a renewed sense of hope. They had taken a stand, and while there was still much work to be done, they were committed to the fight. That evening, as they shared dinner with Mrs. Johnson, they talked about the day's events, excitement, and determination shining in their eyes. I can't believe how far we've come, Mr. Johnson said, his voice filled with pride. Michael smiled. This is just the beginning. Together, we can create real change. In that moment, Mr. Johnson knew that with the support of his community and the strength of his family, they would keep fighting for justice. The path ahead would be challenging, but he was ready to face it, side by side with his son and their neighbors. Together, they were a force for change, and they would not back down. The power of unity. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. The march had ignited a fire within the community, and people were determined to keep the momentum going. Mr. Johnson and Michael found themselves busier than ever, organizing meetings and planning strategies to ensure their voices would not be forgotten. As the sun rose on the third day after the march, Mr. Johnson sipped his coffee on the porch, reflecting on the events of the past week. He felt a sense of purpose that he hadn't experienced in years. Michael joined him, holding a stack of papers. "Dad, I've been thinking. We need to document everything that's happened. The stories, the experiences, everything." Mr. Johnson nodded, intrigued. "What do you have in mind?" "I want to create a community report," Michael explained, excitement lighting up his eyes. "We can gather testimonies from everyone who spoke out at the march and include statistics about racial discrimination in our town. Then we can present it to the police department and city council. It will show them we are serious about making changes." "That's a great idea," Mr. Johnson agreed. "If we can put everything together in one document, it will make a stronger impact. We'll need to reach out to as many people as possible." With that, they began to draft a plan for gathering testimonies. Michael created a flyer inviting community members to share their stories and experiences. They would hold an open meeting at the community center the following week, allowing everyone to speak freely and share their thoughts. As word spread about the upcoming meeting, more and more people expressed their interest. Mr. Johnson could see the community coming together, sharing their stories, and standing strong in unity. Each voice added weight to their cause, transforming their individual struggles into a collective movement. When the day of the meeting arrived, the community center was packed. People filled every chair, and some even stood along the walls, eager to listen and share. Mr. Johnson looked around, feeling a swell of pride as he took in the sight of his neighbors gathered together, united by a common purpose. Michael stepped up to the front of the room, his voice calm but firm. "Thank you all for coming today. We're here to share our stories and make sure our voices are heard. Each of you has faced challenges, and together, we can create change." One by one, people began to share their experiences. An elderly woman spoke about how she had been followed around a store, her every move scrutinized. A young man shared how he had been pulled over for no reason, his heart racing as he feared for his life. Each story resonated with the audience, the pain and frustration palpable in the air. As Mr. Johnson listened, he felt tears welling in his eyes. These were the stories of his community, stories of strength, resilience, and a desire for justice. It became clear that their pain was not just personal. It was a shared experience that demanded attention. After several emotional testimonies, Mr. Johnson stood up, feeling compelled to speak. "Thank you all for your bravery in sharing your stories. We are not alone in this fight. Each of us has faced challenges, but together we can change the narrative. We must continue to stand united and demand respect and justice for everyone." The crowd erupted in applause, the room filled with a sense of camaraderie. Michael smiled at his father, pride evident in his eyes. "We'll compile all these stories and data into our report. This will help show the police and city officials the real impact of their actions." As the meeting continued, more voices chimed in, discussing ways to keep the momentum alive. Ideas flowed: community workshops, educational programs, and regular meetings to ensure their voices remained strong. The energy in the room was infectious, and Mr. Johnson felt a renewed sense of hope. They were not just fighting against discrimination. They were building a better future for themselves and generations to come. As the meeting concluded, Mr. Johnson and Michael worked with their neighbors to gather contact information and create a list of volunteers who could help with the report. The excitement in the air was palpable, and everyone was eager to contribute. That night, as Mr. Johnson and Michael sat down to review their notes, Mr. Johnson reflected on how far they had come. "You know, son, this is more than just a fight for justice. It's about creating a sense of belonging and community." Michael nodded, his eyes shining with determination. "We're showing everyone that we care about each other. This isn't just for us. It's for future generations." Mr. Johnson felt a wave of pride wash over him. They were no longer just a father and son. They were part of something much bigger, a movement for change. He knew the road ahead would be challenging, but with the support of their community, they could face anything. Over the next few weeks, they worked tirelessly, gathering testimonies, compiling data, and creating their community report. Each story added depth to their mission, and as they delved into the statistics, the reality of their fight became even clearer. Finally, the day came when they were ready to present their report to the police department and the city council. The community was buzzing with excitement, and Mr. Johnson felt a mix of nerves and anticipation. This was their chance to demand change and hold those in power accountable. As they gathered outside the police station, Mr. Johnson looked around at the faces of his neighbors, filled with determination and hope. They had come together as a family, ready to confront injustice and fight for a better tomorrow. The power of unity had transformed their fears into strength, and they were prepared to make their voices heard. The showdown. The day of the presentation dawned bright and clear. Mr. Johnson awoke early, his mind racing with thoughts of the community report. Today was crucial. They had worked tirelessly, and the moment had finally arrived to present their findings to the police department and city council. He felt a mix of excitement and anxiety as he prepared for the day ahead. At the community center, people gathered, their expressions a blend of determination and hope. Michael stood at the front, adjusting the projector for the presentation. Mr. Johnson could see the confidence radiating from his son, and it filled him with pride. "You're going to do great, Michael," he said, patting his shoulder. "Thanks, Dad. We're all in this together," Michael replied, a smile lighting up his face. As the hour approached, Mr. Johnson took a deep breath, calming his nerves. They had a powerful message to share, and he knew that if they stood together, their voices would resonate. He scanned the crowd, seeing familiar faces, neighbors, friends, and families who had come to support them. Finally, it was time. Michael stepped up to the podium, and the room fell silent. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his voice steady. "We're here to present our report on racial discrimination in our community and to demand accountability from our police department." With that, he clicked the remote, and the first slide appeared on the screen. It displayed a powerful image of their recent march, filled with people holding signs demanding justice. The audience murmured in appreciation. Over the past few weeks, Michael continued, "We've gathered testimonies from community members about their experiences with law enforcement. We've compiled this report to highlight the issues and propose solutions for a better future." As he spoke, Mr. Johnson felt a surge of pride wash over him. This was their moment, the culmination of their hard work and determination. Michael shared the stories of those who had bravely spoken out, bringing their words to life. The audience listened intently, each testimony stirring emotions. When Michael reached the statistics section, he showed graphs illustrating the disparity in treatment based on race. "These numbers tell a clear story," he said. "We cannot ignore the reality of discrimination in our town. We need to address it together." The room buzzed with murmurs of agreement. Mr. Johnson could feel the energy shifting. People were engaged, invested in the outcome of their presentation. As Michael concluded the report, he looked directly at the gathered officials. "We're not here to blame anyone. We want to work together to create change. We need community policing initiatives, sensitivity training, and regular meetings to ensure our voices are heard." With that, the room erupted in applause, and Mr. Johnson felt a wave of hope. This was a significant step forward, and the community was ready to stand behind their demands. Next, the police chief stood up, his expression serious. "Thank you for your presentation. We acknowledge the issues raised and appreciate your courage in coming forward. We want to work with you to build trust and accountability within our department." Mr. Johnson felt a mix of relief and skepticism. Would this truly lead to change? He exchanged glances with Michael, who looked hopeful. "I believe in dialogue and understanding," the chief continued. "We'll set up a community forum to discuss these issues further and outline a plan for action." As the discussion unfolded, community members began to voice their concerns and ideas. They spoke about the need for better communication between the police and residents, the importance of training officers to understand racial issues, and the necessity of accountability for any misconduct. The atmosphere shifted, becoming more collaborative. Mr. Johnson watched as people who had once felt powerless now found their voices. This was what they had fought for, the chance to be heard. After a lengthy discussion, the meeting concluded with a commitment from the police chief to work on the proposed initiatives. As people filed out of the building, Mr. Johnson felt a sense of accomplishment wash over him. They had taken significant steps toward change, but the journey was far from over. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the town. Mr. Johnson and Michael stood together, absorbing the day's events. "We did it, Dad," Michael exclaimed, his eyes shining with excitement. "This is just the beginning." Mr. Johnson nodded, a smile spreading across his face. "Yes, it is. But we must stay vigilant and keep pushing for change. This is our community, and we all deserve to feel safe and respected." As they walked home, the streets felt alive with possibility. The unity they had built over the past weeks had transformed their fight into a movement, and together, they were stronger than ever. That evening, as they sat down for dinner, Mr. Johnson reflected on the journey they had taken. The road ahead would be filled with challenges, but he felt hopeful. The community had come together, united by a shared vision for justice, and he knew that with their collective strength, they could continue to effect change. In the days that followed, Mr. Johnson and Michael remained active, participating in community forums and working closely with the police department to implement the proposed changes. They organized workshops, inviting speakers to educate residents about their rights and how to interact with law enforcement. Slowly but surely, the atmosphere in their town began to shift. More people felt empowered to speak up, and relationships between community members and the police started to improve. Trust was being rebuilt, and Mr. Johnson was proud to see the change they had all worked so hard to create. As they sat together one evening, discussing their progress, Michael looked at his father and said, "You know, Dad, we've shown everyone that unity is powerful. Together, we can make a real difference." Mr. Johnson smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "Yes, son, this is just the beginning of our journey. We must continue to stand together, fight for justice, and make our voices heard." And so, they remained committed to their cause, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The power of unity had brought them this far, and together, they knew they could accomplish anything. A new dawn. Weeks turned into months, and the transformation in the community continued to unfold. Mr. Johnson and Michael watched as their efforts to promote unity and understanding began to take root. The town was gradually becoming a place where everyone felt seen and heard, and the police department was actively engaging with residents to foster better relationships. One crisp morning, Mr. Johnson received a phone call from the police chief. "Mr. Johnson, we'd like to invite you and Michael to a community event next month," the chief said. "We're hosting a community day to celebrate our progress and share what we've accomplished together." Mr. Johnson's heart swelled with pride. "That sounds wonderful. Thank you for including us. We'd be honored to participate." As the date approached, excitement buzzed through the town. The event would feature booths for community organizations, food from local vendors, and discussions about the ongoing efforts for reform. Mr. Johnson and Michael eagerly prepared, knowing this was another opportunity to strengthen their community ties. On the day of the event, the park was transformed into a vibrant gathering space, filled with laughter and conversation. Families set up picnics, children played games, and the scent of delicious food wafted through the air. Mr. Johnson marveled at the sight of people from different backgrounds mingling, sharing stories, and building connections. When it was time for the speeches, Mr. Johnson took the stage alongside the police chief, local leaders, and community members. He felt a sense of responsibility as he stood in front of the crowd, ready to address the progress they had made together. "Thank you all for coming today," Mr. Johnson began, his voice steady. "Today is a celebration of our community's strength and resilience. We have come together to confront injustice and to seek understanding. Each one of you has played a vital role in this journey." The crowd cheered, And Mr. Johnson continued, "We've learned that when we stand united, our voices are powerful. Our fight for justice is not over, but together, we are making strides toward a brighter future." The police chief stepped forward next, expressing gratitude for the community's partnership. "We recognize that rebuilding trust takes time, and we are committed to listening and learning from each of you. Together, we will create a safer and more inclusive environment for all." As the speeches concluded, various community members took the stage to share their stories and experiences. Each narrative was a testament to the growth and change that had taken place, and the audience listened with rapt attention. Mr. Johnson felt a deep sense of pride, knowing that their fight for justice had sparked a movement, and it was inspiring others to share their experiences. After the speeches, people began to mingle, and Mr. Johnson noticed a group of young adults gathered around a table where Michael was leading a discussion about community policing. He walked over, eager to see how the conversation was unfolding. "Dad, you should join us," Michael exclaimed, gesturing for him to come closer. "We're talking about ways to keep our momentum going and ensure that our voices are consistently heard." Mr. Johnson nodded and took a seat among the group. They brainstormed ideas for future community meetings, workshops on conflict resolution, and strategies to maintain communication with the police department. The energy in the room was palpable, and Mr. Johnson felt hopeful as he listened to their passionate ideas. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the park, Mr. Johnson stepped back and took in the scene. Families were laughing, children were playing, and community members were engaging in meaningful conversations. It was a stark contrast to the tension and fear that had once gripped their town. Later in the evening, as the event wound down, Mr. Johnson found a quiet moment with Michael. "I can't believe how far we've come," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "It's incredible to see our community come together like this." Michael smiled, his eyes shining with pride. "We did this together, Dad. It shows what can happen when we stand up for what's right. We've created a space for dialogue and understanding." As they walked home under the starlit sky, Mr. Johnson felt a sense of peace wash over him. The fight against injustice was ongoing, but they had built a foundation that would support future generations. He knew that as long as they remained united, their voices would continue to resonate. In the weeks that followed, the community remained engaged and active. They organized regular meetings to discuss progress and address new challenges. The police department began implementing the training programs and initiatives they had proposed, focusing on building trust and transparency. One afternoon, as Mr. Johnson tended to his garden, he received a visit from a few neighbors who had been actively involved in the movement. "Mr. Johnson, we wanted to thank you for your leadership," one of them said, sincerity in their eyes. "You've inspired us all to speak up and take action." Mr. Johnson felt humbled by their words. "It's not just me. This is a community effort. Each of you has played a role in making our town a better place." As summer turned to fall, the community continued to grow stronger. More families participated in events, and the dialogue with law enforcement evolved into a meaningful partnership. Mr. Johnson and Michael had become known as advocates for change, but they never sought recognition. Their mission was to uplift their community and ensure that every voice mattered. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the leaves change color, Michael turned to his father. "Dad, what do you think is next for us?" Mr. Johnson paused, considering the question. "I think we need to continue this work. There are always more people to reach and more stories to tell. Our fight for justice is ongoing, and we must keep pushing for change." With determination in his eyes, Michael nodded. "Let's keep the momentum going. We have the power to inspire others, just like we've been inspired." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Mr. Johnson felt a renewed sense of purpose. They had ignited a spark within their community, and together they would continue to shine a light on injustice. The journey ahead would be long, but with unity, compassion, and unwavering determination, they could face anything. In that moment, under the changing leaves and the vast sky, Mr. Johnson knew they were creating a legacy of hope, one that would echo through generations to come. And that legacy would remind everyone that the power to create change lay within their hearts and their hands.